I would like to get very vulnerable with you today, so I just want to offer a trigger warning that my talk will mention mental illnesses, abuse in relationships, and suicide, but very briefly. So just take the precautions that you think are necessary, knowing this in advance. Okay, let's try it now. Perfect. So my story today begins in my small hometown of New Hamburg, Ontario. New Hamburg is my home, and it's located about 30 minutes away from here. Look to the left, and you'll see some newly built suburban homes. And to the right, you'll see endless patches of farmland and the occasional cow or horse as well. I was like most imaginative kids. I self-identified as leader of the Playground Snail Club at my one hallway elementary school. And on the weekends, I would sell imaginary coffee at our Tim Hortons drive-thru in my grandma's living room. I love to ride my bike down the hill of my street because it made me feel powerful and strong. I was young, but I really felt powerful and strong. As I got older, much of my imagination remained the same, but I was growing more aware of the world around me, and truthfully, it worried me. As years passed, I kept riding my bike down that hill on my street, but it did begin to feel different. I began to notice that if I was riding my bike down the hill and I accidentally hit the wheel of my bike on the right side of the curb, I would feel called to steer over to the left and actually bounce the wheel of my bike on the left side as well. I don't know why, but it made me feel balanced and it made me feel better. My imagination and creativity really never wavered. I was a busy little bee. In grade 3, I organized a Looney or Toonie Day to raise money for Plan Canada to build some schools in other countries. When I got nervous, I began to do finger patterns to comfort myself, and I had to make sure to balance pressure on every single finger. In 2012, when online articles were swarming with conspiracies about the world ending, I would lose hours of my day trying to find the answers and deciding how I wanted to spend my final days. In grade 4, my teacher had a quick temper and it made me very jumpy, and I begged my parents to let me out of the class, but had no such luck. I would finger tap 1, 2, 3, 4 every day. In grade 8, I had to change schools. My elementary school did not go to grade 8, so I was shipped across town to the school where my mom actually taught music. I joined the social justice, music, and student council committees, jumping at any leadership opportunity that I could get. I spent any lunch that I could in the music room with my mom, though, avoiding the cafeteria at all costs. It was too busy, and I hated when I walked in and everyone was staring at me. Even as a young one, I had already learned to fear my body and being watched. I still remember Sarah's particularly terrifying glare as I would walk up the stairs, and I would finger tap 1, 2, 3, 4. By high school, I started having conversations with the right people. I found words for what I was experiencing: generalized anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, and eventually depression. Flash forward to my final 2 years of high school. I had witnessed the grief of losing someone by suicide before, but it wasn't until a tragic death struck my small high school community that I truly felt the devastation. Not only that, but I felt the weight of all of my classmates who didn't know how to talk about it. My community was grieving, but they were doing so in isolation. In response to witnessing this isolation, a friend and I developed and co-founded the Bridges of Hope project. For 2 successful years, we held events at local bridges in grieving communities, New Hamburg and Waterloo included. Speakers shared their stories of mental health healing and recovery, and we attached positive messages to the bridges. We reached kids, parents, politicians, social workers, superintendents, and Carolina. I met Carolina at an event for youth mental health, and I was immediately drawn to her wisdom. Through Bridges of Hope and my other endeavors, she has supported me unwaveringly, and I am so grateful. She was one of the most powerful storytellers I had ever met, and that still holds true today. One day, she asked me to speak at her own storytelling event called Light Stories. I was astonished to be considered and was equally terrified to share my story and my truth. What was my story? I didn't know what my truth was either. At the time that Carolina invited me to Light Stories, I'd just begun my undergrad here at UW, and I was enrolled in Sociology 101 with Dr. Sharon Roberts, if that's familiar to any of you. I found it really challenging to make it to this Tuesday night evening class. The drive from New Hamburg to campus felt really long at night, and my peers had already made close friends from living in residence, so I felt really alone. Each week, this class focused on a new topic. Lectures on systemic discrimination and inequalities in all areas of the world. Discussions of racism, sexism, poverty, and so much more. My professor was really educated on issues right within Canada, especially the Waterloo region. She would often make comments like, if you take anything away from this course, remember that the baby boomers are going to be a large portion of the population. So if you want a job, you've got to work in there. I was growing wiser, but that small child who started a loony or toonie day at her elementary school was still finger tapping away. And one night, the part of me that was still that small child impulsively made her way up to the front of her class after the lecture ended. This small child found herself asking a question that would later be the life-changing story I would share at Light Stories. I had waited until the room cleared out. I looked at my professor and I said that I really appreciated her class. She thanked me, but I was so nervous and I didn't really know why I was standing there. I asked her, so I'm just wondering, what is it like to teach these kinds of things? Like all the time, don't you just feel like you want to change everything? How do you slow down? Don't you feel guilty? And right as the words left my mouth, I knew that I was no longer asking my teacher that question. I was asking myself. I was asking for the version of myself who had just spent 2 years holding space for communities that were grieving, the stories of people who were grieving. People who had experienced mental health challenges and needed community that I was responsible for and wanted to put all of my energy towards building. She nodded graciously and said to me, yes, of course, it gets difficult. But what I do know is that when I teach this course, I'm educating 250 or more young adults on issues that are covered up, issues that they didn't know about before. I get to share this information as my piece of making the world a better place. I felt a lump in my throat, and my ears had turned hot, and I knew that I was unraveling. She looked at me and said one sentence that I will never forget, a sentence that has changed how I see myself, how I heal, how I give, how I love, how I support. It has changed how I share those stories around me. She said to me, but you know, one thing that I do know is that you can't create change from feeling guilty about it. Real change never comes from guilt. And it was like she had read my mind. I'd looked her in the eyes and I had asked her if she felt guilty, but I might as well have stood in front of a mirror. I rushed out of the room as quickly as I could with tears in my eyes, and once I made it outside, I let them fall. And after a while, I found myself smiling, realizing what this meant for myself, what it meant for the rest of my life. I shared this story with the audience at Light Stories that winter. I shared how I'm a sensitive person who has really taken years to understand that side of herself. I shared how I cope with my own grief by feeling personally responsible for creating change in my own community. And that I did feel guilty. I felt guilty for struggling with my mental health, guilty that my life was not linear or going the way that I had planned at all. I felt guilty for being an oblivious white teenager who wormed her way through a privileged life without knowing enough to question it. Most importantly, I was feeling guilty about doing anything other than taking care of those in my community. I recognize this story as an important one to share. When I reflected on how that moment with my professor made me feel, I could actually recall sensations in my body. I remember feeling like someone had just put blinders on me and all I could hear was her voice. I remember hearing a quiet voice in the back of my mind saying, wow, that was important. I remember my heart pounding. I remember the adrenaline. I remember wanting to tell anyone and everyone about what I had just experienced because it was just that powerful. When I finished my talk at Light Stories, I connected with an audience member afterwards, and she had really resonated with my talk. She was in tears, explaining that she had just left an abusive relationship and felt really guilty for it. I helped change her perspective on that. I remember thinking, I did that? For years, I knew that stories were important. With Bridges of Hope, I had witnessed strangers connecting with each other over shared grief, struggles, and their own triumphs. I saw it, but I don't think I truly felt it until this night. Stories are important because they connect us to each other. They allow us to explore experiences with others that are so powerful that sometimes words are all that we have to attempt to describe their impact. Not only was it powerful to share this story, but I was surrounded by other incredible women who are committed to being a listener that night. Listening, but also understanding. And for them, I would sit in the audience and do the same. This story is particularly important to me because it stems from one singular, powerful interaction between myself and another woman. As women, our stories often get sidelined or silenced. That's just a fact. And the power of bringing forward a moment that I had with another strong woman made me feel like one. And the love that I received from an audience of women I did not know changed my life. From my experience with stories, figuring out which ones I want to share and when, the advice I can offer is this. Notice what you feel in your body. When did you feel like you had just experienced a core memory or witnessed a life-changing moment? What messages did a younger version of yourself really need to hear that you've heard now? What were the moments that changed how you saw yourself or the world around you? I knew that I wanted to share that story with the Light Stories audience. Every single story that we have brings together those around us in different ways. Every story is important. And thanks to my professor and the incredible women I've had the privilege to learn from in my lifetime, I have grown to recognize just how essential our stories are to understanding each other truly. We need stories just as much as we need each other.